Okay, class, it's time to talk about the microscopic anatomy of skeletal muscle and how contraction works. Now, this part is probably the most complicated part um, of the muscular system, how this works. So hopefully this will make sense. If you have struggles with it, let me know. I'm happy to go over it with you again. Look at some different videos on YouTube. I'll show you. There's a video on PowerPoint here that shows kind of how this works. But yeah, just try to work through it and take some time and figure out exactly how this is happening. So let me explain it to you. So in order to understand how contraction works, we have to know a little bit more about the muscle fibers. Remember, the muscle fiber is a muscle cell. It's a single muscle cell. And within a muscle fiber, within that muscle cell, there are some things that are found within it. And the main ones are things called myosin and actin. Okay, actin and myosin are proteins that are produced by muscle cells, and that's what muscles are packed full of, is proteins. These proteins are what carry out the contraction of the muscle. And this really makes sense if you think about if you know anybody that works out a lot or is a bodybuilder or something like that. They're always worried about consuming protein. They'll do all these different things to make sure they're getting enough protein, because they know that protein, they may not understand how this is all working, so you can explain this to them, but what they do know is that they need protein to build their muscles. So our muscles are packed full of protein. If we go back and look at the picture of the muscle cell, this is why the nuclei of the muscle are pushed up against the very edges of the muscle, because the rest of the muscle is just packed full of protein. And so there's not room for all these other organelles. They get pushed to the side. They still have a function, but everything inside here is just protein. Okay, so this protein is called myofibrils. Okay, myofibrils. In other words, the actin and myosin are what make up these myofibrils. So the myofibrils are proteins that run the length of the muscle fiber, and they are set up in little groupings, which we call sarcomeres. Okay, so groupings maybe isn't the best word, but so these myofibrils are running the length of the cell, and sections of them is a better way to say it. Sections of them are called sarcomeres. So we section it up, and we call these a sarcomere. So a sarcomere is the functional contracting unit of a muscle, and the space between two sarcomeres is called a Z-line. Okay, so these myofibrils are made up of actin and myosin, which are myofilaments, protein myofilaments. So, one other thing to mention here. So myo, whenever you see that MYO beginning here, that is referring to muscle. So myofibrils, myosin, myofilaments, all relating to muscle. We also see this beginning of the word sarco. Sarco means flesh, and so we'll see it associated with the muscular system as well. So sarcomeres, sarcoplasmic reticulum, etc., related to muscles as well, means flesh. Okay, so let's look at how this is set up here. All right, so in the previous video we talked about the makeup of a muscle. So remember, endomysium, paramysium, epimysium. So we're seeing these words again. Now we're just going a little bit deeper here. So let's put this all in order here. So if we were to take a single muscle, such as this bicep muscle here in your arm, so you got a bicep muscle, that whole muscle itself is surrounded by an epimysium. So remember, this muscle is made up of multiple muscle fibers or cells, all bundled together to form this whole muscle, and it's surrounded by epimysium, which is a connective tissue covering. Now, if we were to open up that muscle, we would see that the muscle itself is made up of bundles of muscle fibers called fascicles, and each fascicle is surrounded by paramysium. Okay, so we have the muscle itself with epimysium made up of fascicles surrounded by paramysium, and then within each fascicle, so here they've taken the fascicle and they've blown it out towards you. Here's a single fascicle surrounded by paramysium. Within each fascicle we have these muscle fibers. This is a single muscle fiber that's popped out towards you, and each muscle fiber is surrounded by endomysium, a connective tissue covering around each individual muscle fiber. Now we're going to go a little bit deeper. Now within each muscle fiber, we have myofibrils, which are, again, these are the protein pieces that make up the muscle fiber. So each muscle cell is made up of many myofibrils, and the myofibrils are made up of myofilaments, which there are two of, the myosin and the actin filaments. Okay? So each muscle fiber is made up of myofibrils, bundles of myofibrils, which are proteins called myofilaments, which are either actin or myosin. So there's two types there. So does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. You'll want to kind of know that general anatomy. It's kind of a hierarchy, like we talked about with organization of living things. This is the hierarchy of muscle anatomy. Now we're gonna go down and just look at a single muscle fiber. Okay, so here's a single muscle fiber, and these are the myofibrils inside the muscle fiber. See these little contractile pieces here. So here's a myofibril. This is the sarcolemma. So that sarco again means flesh. That means we're talking about a muscle. So sarcolemma is a fancy name for the plasma membrane of a muscle cell. You also see sarcoplasmic reticulum. So remember, in a general cell we have something called endoplasmic reticulum. So in a muscle cell, the endoplasmic reticulum has a special name. They call it sarcoplasmic reticulum, and so it's sarco again relating to the muscle. And then we have sarcomeres, and this is where we're going to focus. So here's our muscle fiber. We pulled one of these little myofibrils out, and we're looking at a myofibril. You can see this little kind of greenish zigzag line there. That's a Z line that we talked about. So here's a Z line, here's a Z line. If we went farther in, there'd be another Z line. And all along the myofibril, we have these Z lines. So the myofibril is a single, long, cylindrical piece, but it has these little junctions called Z lines. And from one Z line to a next Z line, we call that a single sarcomere. So that's the contractile unit right there. So here's one Z line, here's another Z line. This is a sarcomere. Here's a Z line, the other Z line we can't quite see, but that'd be the next sarcomere, and etc. So all the length of this myofibril, we have multiple Z lines and multiple sarcomeres all lined up next to each other to create that myofibril. And then within that myofibril, we then have the actin and myosin, and that's what we're going to look at. That's what we're going to look at next. A couple other things to point out here. Notice the mitochondria. So there are lots of mitochondria in the muscle cell. And that's because we need energy, we need ATP in order to contract our muscles. So we would expect to see lots of mitochondria stuffed in here among the myofibrils. Notice the nuclei as well, the multiple nuclei. And then notice that the sarcoplasmic reticulum has calcium stored in it. So calcium is essential for muscle movement. And so that's where that calcium is stored. And when that calcium is released, that's what causes our muscles to contract. And then it's pulled back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and our muscles relax. Okay, so here we go. We're going to move on now. So myofibrils made up of sarcomeres that are designated by one Z line to the next Z line. So now we're going to look at the myofilaments that make up these myofibrils. All right, so let's get our bearings here. So now we're looking at a myofibril, and here's the zigzag line. Here's a zigzag line, which is the Z line, and one Z line to the next Z line is a sarcomere. So we're looking at a single sarcomere basically here, and here's a single sarcomere. Now within the sarcomere, we have thick filaments, which are myosin filaments, and we have thin filaments, which are actin filaments. So those are our two types of myofilaments, actin and myosin. And you can see how they overlap each other. So the actin is the thin filament because it looks thin, and the myosin is the thick one because it's thicker. Notice also that the myosin has all these little projections. We call them myosin heads. So the myosin almost looks like, so from here to the end, it almost looks like you took a whole bunch of golf clubs and you have them all packaged together, and the golf golf club heads are pointed out in all directions. That's what the myosin looks like. The actin looks like a whole bunch of little beads. Each of these little beads is a little protein unit. They're all hooked together, so it looks like a chain of beads. So we have a chain of beads. We've got a bunch of golf clubs, chain of beads, and they're just interwoven here among the muscle. All right, so Z line. So here's where it all comes together. So we have actin overlapping myosin, and when a sarcomere is in a relaxed position, notice that there's some spaces here. There's a space here in the middle, and there's some space here at the ends where the actin and myosin don't fully overlap. Now, when our muscles contract, what is happening is these little myosin heads are attaching to the actin, and they're pulling the actin closer to each other. So see, the space as it contracts is going to disappear. All of these spaces are going to disappear. So again, the myosin heads are going to attach to the actin, and they're actually going to pull. They're going to have a little pulling motion, and those two Z lines are going to come closer together as the myosin pulls the actin closer together. Now this is just a tiny little bit, but across the stretch of the myofibril, all of these individual sarcomeres are just going to be, each one is going to be shortening just a tiny bit, and so over the course of the whole myofibril, that's going to lead to a full muscle contraction. And that's what causes our muscles to contract, these little proteins inside our muscle cells that are pulling closer together, creating less space, and pulling those actin filaments together. And that's basically it. That's what's going on. I mean, there's more details to it, but that's the general idea. Let me pause here to go back and talk about striations. So remember that skeletal muscle is striated. Remember those banding patterns we see in skeletal muscle? Well, this is why we have those bands in muscle fibers, is because of the overlap of actin and myosin. So the dark bands are caused by the areas where the actin and myosin are overlapping with each other. So it looks darker under the microscope just because there's more protein there. And the light bands are caused by these areas where all that is there is actin. Okay. So dark bands, so the striations are caused by dark bands by the overlap of actin and myosin, and the light bands by areas where you just see the actin. So when a muscle is contracted, if you look at it under a microscope, you're not going to see those light bands. You're not going to see those light bands because everything's going to be overlapped with each other. So those light bands are going to disappear as your muscle contracts. Obviously, when we look under a microscope, we're not looking at contracted muscle. It's relaxed because it's generally no longer living when we're looking at it under a microscope. So we see those banding patterns. If we could watch that contraction, we would see those light bands disappearing. So let's take a look at a video here to see if we can help this make sense. Actually seeing the animation of how this happens, I think, will help. So let's get our bearings here. So here's the Z line, here's the Z line, here's the Z line. So we are looking at 1, 2 sarcomeres. And the sarcomeres are made up of myofilaments called actin and myosin. Here's the actin. In this case, it's colored green. That's the chain of beads. We have all these little actin units here attached to the Z line. And then we have the myosin, which is the thick filament with all the golf club heads pointing in all directions, overlapping the actin in both sarcomeres here. Okay, so what's going to happen during a contraction? So watch this. During a contraction, the myosin filaments are going to attach to the actin, and look how it's pulling it closer together. So the spaces here are disappearing as the actin is pulled closer together. Now notice that in each sarcomere here, in each case, the actin came closer together and the spaces disappeared. So as this happens on all of the sarcomeres across the muscle, that's going to cause that contraction. Alright, and then our muscle will relax, and it'll go back to its former position that we saw at the very beginning here. So this is a relaxed muscle, and then what happens once again, so the myosin attaches to the actin, and through some kind of almost like a rowing motion, right? It pulls the actin filaments closer together, and the spaces disappear, and we now have a muscle contraction. Does that make sense? Hopefully that all makes sense. So let's review something real quick. Can you list the hierarchy of muscle anatomy, going from, so starting from the full muscle surrounded by epimysium down to the actin and myosin. So hit pause on the video here and write down, I want you to write down that hierarchy, and then we'll come back and we'll review it. I'm going to play a little Jeopardy music for you. Okay, so welcome back. Hopefully you paused the video and wrote that all down. So let's go over the hierarchy. So I'm going to say it to you, and then I'll show you the picture to review. So we have the full muscle surrounded by epimysium, and the full muscle is made up of bundles of fascicles, and those fascicles are surrounded by perimysium. Each fascicle is made up of individual muscle fibers. Each muscle fiber is surrounded by endomysium. Within the muscle fibers, we have the myofibrils. The myofibrils are made up of myofilaments called actin and myosin. Okay, so going the other way, we have actin and myosin, which are myofilaments that form the myofibrils, and the myofibrils are packed inside an individual muscle cell called a muscle fiber. Each muscle fiber is surrounded by endomysium. The muscle fibers are bundled together in fascicles, and those fascicles are surrounded by perimysium, and then bundles of fascicles form the full muscle, which is surrounded by epimysium. So did you get that? So here it is. So you have the full muscle, epimysium, fascicles, perimysium, muscle fibers, endomysium. Within the muscle fibers we have the myofibrils. The myofibrils are made up of actin and myosin, myofilaments. There you go. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about before we end this video is how the muscles are stimulated to contract. And this is where the nervous system comes into play. Okay, so our muscles, because we have voluntary control of our muscles, we can send a signal from our brain that says, okay, move such and such a muscle. So our nerves are gonna go from our brain, and they're gonna reach a muscle. And where a nerve and a muscle meet each other, we call that a neuromuscular junction. And that's what we're going to look at now, is the neuromuscular junction. Before I look at that though, the motor unit is a muscle, a neuron, and all the muscle fibers it stimulates. So let's look at a picture here. So here's a neuron coming down from a nerve. This is our nervous system, and that neuron is going to stimulate. These are individual muscle fibers here. These are muscle cells. A single neuron may stimulate multiple muscle cells, and so this single thing here is called a motor unit. This is a motor unit. The neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it controls. Okay? All right. Now we're going to look at the neuromuscular junction and what's going on here. So where the neuron meets the muscle, you can see here, it looks like the neuron's sitting right on the muscle, but in actuality, there's a tiny, tiny space there between the muscle and the neuron. And this is kind of what it looks like. So here, this yellow thing is the neuron, and then the red part down here, this is the muscle. So there's this little space. This junction here is called a synapse. Where the neuron meets the muscle is a synapse. And this space here is called the synaptic cleft. So the nervous system is an electrical signal that's coming down. And so at this neuromuscular junction, this message from the neuron needs to get across to the muscle to tell it to contract. And so we have some chemicals here. So this is the interesting part. So our nervous system is sending an electrical signal down, but when it reaches the muscles, there are some chemicals that have to be released that tell the muscle to contract. And these chemicals are called acetylcholine. This is a really big word, so we abbreviated capital A, capital C, and then a lowercase h. So acetylcholine, this is the chemical that's going to go across the synaptic cleft in synaptic vesicles to cause this contraction in the muscle. One other word I didn't tell you yet, the axon terminal. The axon terminal, this is where the neuron ends, because the neuron itself, the end of a neuron is called an axon. So the axon terminal is where that neuron ends, where it comes in almost contact with the muscle fiber. Okay, so you have our axon terminal, we've got the synaptic cleft. So what's going to happen here? So as the nervous system, let me just show you this as I talk about it. So as the signal comes down down the neuron, it's going to reach the end of the neuron, the end of the axon, and that's going to stimulate this axon to release the acetylcholine, which will move across the synaptic cleft. So let's watch this happening. So the signal causes these channels to open, which bring in calcium. Calcium triggers these little vesicles to move to the edge of the axon. Now these little vesicles are surrounded by membrane, and it's the same as the plasma membrane of the axon terminal. And so as these reach the end, they join with the membrane, and that allows the acetylcholine to be released out into the synaptic cleft. After it's released out, it travels across the synaptic cleft, and it attaches to these junctions that are located on the muscle itself. Okay, so these acetylcholines attaching to these junctions causes these junctions to open, which allows chemicals to come in, which causes the muscle to be stimulated to begin contracting. So that's what happens here. So now we're sending a signal down the muscle that says, okay, now we need to contract. So let's go over that one more time. So the signal comes down the axon, to the end of the axon, to the axon terminal, which causes a protein channel to open, which allows calcium to flow into the axon, and that stimulates these synaptic vesicles to move to the edge of the axon and release the acetylcholine out into the synaptic cleft. The acetylcholine then travels across the cleft and attaches to these channels on the muscle fiber, which open up, and that sends a signal down the muscle which says, okay, now it's time to contract. So after this acetylcholine is going to attach, in order to relax the muscle, we have to break down the acetylcholine and put it back into the axon. And so there are chemicals here as well that their job is to chop up the acetylcholine. You can see it's made up of a couple different pieces. Okay, so these chemicals chop up the acetylcholine into pieces, which then can be reabsorbed into the axon here, axon terminal, and acetylcholine can be reproduced, put into vesicles, so that our muscle can then contract again. And there you go. Wow, that's a lot of stuff to learn. Here it is written out in the slides. You can kind of read through. The nerve signal comes from the brain. Synaptic vesicles release acetylcholine, and it goes across the synaptic cleft through diffusion, binds to the receptors, and then that causes the receptors to open and generate an action potential, which causes the muscle to contract. Remember, the muscle contraction, as we mentioned, takes calcium. So that's what's being released as a calcium. And then that calcium allows those actin and myosin filaments to move across each other, and that leads to muscle contraction. And so now, you guys know how this all works. You guys know how muscle contraction works. You know the microscopic anatomy. Let me just mention a couple other things real quick that relate to this. One is botulism. So botulism toxin is one of the most potent poisons that is known to man. And it's produced by a little bacteria called Clostridium botulinum. So this little bacteria produces this toxin, and the way this toxin works is it affects the neuromuscular junction. What it does is it keeps the muscle, or the neuron, from being able to release acetylcholine. So what that means is if you can't release acetylcholine, then the muscle can't be stimulated to contract. So in other words, there's no muscle contraction going on. So people that die from botulism, what happens is their breathing muscles can be paralyzed, and it just basically suffocates them. So you've probably heard of this. Well, you may have heard of botulism. One of the main places you can catch botulism is from canned food that has gone bad, I guess, basically. So they say when you go buy canned food at the store, if it's bulging at all, if the sides of the ends of the cans are bulging, don't eat that, because there may be bacteria in there that's producing botulism toxin. If you eat that, then you could potentially die. Botulism, you maybe also heard that little kids until the age of, I guess it's 1 or 2, but they're not supposed to eat honey. And the reason is because there's these little botulism spores, these bacteria spores in the honey. As adults, when we eat it, our digestive system takes care of it. We don't have to worry about it, but little infants aren't able to do that yet, and so they could get botulism toxin from eating honey, so you have to watch out for that. Another way you've heard of it, though, is Botox. So Botox is actually botulism toxin. So this is kind of crazy. I don't know who thought of this, but anyway, it's not as toxic. It's diluted. But what they do is they take that Botox and they inject it into your skin, and what it does is it paralyzes the muscles in your skin, which cause wrinkles. And so that's how they use Botox to treat wrinkles. Kind of a crazy idea. All right, so there you go. That is the ins and outs. Hopefully that made sense. If you have any questions, this ended up being kind of a long video. If you have any questions, let me know.